Hello, and welcome to this session on PTSD, identifying and treating traumatic responses. Before we start, I need to be quite clear that this is an educational session and not a support session, but it may contain some material which is difficult to people who have a personal history of trauma. Therefore, if this is you, I'd recommend that you pause this video at this point and discuss this with someone else, or make sure there's someone around who can support you. What I am going to do is share some slides and talk about this for just under half an hour, which will give you a range of things that you might be able to talk about. Because this is an online digitally recorded session, it's obviously not possible to do a live question and answer session afterwards. So let's talk about the PTSD, these four letters that are so simple, yet have changed so much in how we understand them over the years. I'm talking on behalf of the Mind and Soul Foundation, and the good news is that we've got a large website which contains multiple resources, search function, over 1,000 articles, over 100 talks and videos like this one that you can go back and refer to, or perhaps go and try and answer some of those unanswered questions. My name's Dr. Rob Waller, and my Twitter handle is @DocRobWaller, as you can see there, and the Mind and Soul Foundation is @Mind and Soul UK, or the URL is down the bottom there, mindandsoulfoundation.org. Now, I live a few hundred meters from this place, Craig House, which in the day was called Craig House Hospital. And between the years of 1916 and 1914, there was a unit here dealing with what we first thought of and knew and came to understand as PTSD. It was overseen by a chap called Colonel William Rivers. And today in Edinburgh, the Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder Centre is called the Rivers Centre after him. And he ran a unit here on the Craig House and Craig Lockhart campus in a place which is now being transverted into residential accommodation and is also still partly owned by Edinburgh Napier University. But back at this time, it was a traditional asylum and was used by the precursor to the NHS for that. And they started treating people who were victims of what at that time was called shell shock. And it wasn't really something that was particularly understood. It's something we first saw during the Crimea and the Boer War when heavy artillery started to be used. And that combination of the loud noise and the shock, people thought it was some sort of physical impact on the brain from the explosion. But what became clear over time was that it was not so much physical, but an emotional impact, that sudden rush of adrenaline, people being put in situations that were life-changing, transformative in extremely negative ways and in ways they were not prepared for. Two of the people who made Craig House also quite famous were some of the war poets, Sigurd Sassoon, Wilfred Owen, you might have heard of, you might have studied them when you were at school. And they both were patients at Craig House during that time and both suffered badly with shell shock and what we now know to be PTSD. So Sassoon wrote this poem, "You smug-faced crowds, you know, these are the crowds cheering the soldiers off. You cheer when soldier lads march by. Sneak home and pray you'll never know the hell where youth and laughter go." And that is a deeply, deeply sad poem by Sigurd Sassoon talking about the horrors of war and the ultimate consequences it has for some people, both in terms of death by the hands of others and sadly death by their own hand as well. It's very much what he writes about there. And Wilfred Owen also, "My friend, you would not tell with such high zest to children ardent for some desperate glory, the old lie, dulce et decorum est et pro patria mori. It is right and proper and glorious to die for one's country." I think what he's arguing is that actually never was such a great truth, a great untruth told. And it's not glorious, it's not pretty, it's not messy. And we are now beginning to understand more and more and more about the psychological consequences of war. But there have been changes over time in terms of how we think about this. And one of the things to understand is the difference between what's sometimes called type 1 or type 2 trauma. Type 1 perhaps is classical PTSD that occurs after a single incident. It could be an explosion, it could be a natural disaster, it could be war, it could be a car crash, it could be a one-off sexual assault or similar kind of thing, but it happens and then it doesn't happen, but the person still feels as though it is happening. And that's different to type 2, which is often associated with childhood trauma of a variety of types, and quite often ongoing and long duration. And the reason why it's different is that type 2 trauma, sometimes associated with the phrase complex PTSD, describes both the triad of PTSD symptoms, but also some of the developmental and interpersonal relationship difficulties that can occur when someone experiences a very traumatic childhood. The other thing that we've come to understand more about recently is what people call vicarious trauma, which is secondary trauma in some ways. You see trauma being done to someone else, and that has an effect on you, either because you perhaps begin to experience flashbacks about it, even though it wasn't happening to you, or because you feel somehow responsible, somehow guilty. And I think some of that was going on with what we saw with the Black Lives Matter issues and Sarah Everard. People who were quite some distance from it began to experience symptoms related to trauma and the guilt associated with that. And it's almost as though we have an inbuilt ethical framework in our heads, which is that somehow good people should have good outcomes. If I try hard, if I work hard, I should get a job, life should go okay for me. And we know in our heads that the maths doesn't always work out like that, but we assume in our hearts that that's going on. And then when either something happens that deeply challenges us, we have this sense of moral injury or vicarious trauma. And this can actually happen in PTSD itself, in the person who has actually been traumatized, in that not only has the trauma caused some changes in their brain, which I'll come on to talk about a bit later, but the trauma has also deeply challenged their whole ethical framework. And it's not just a matter of doing some CBT, some cognitive behavioral therapy to process those memories. People really need to deal with things around justice and acceptance and how can I make sense of this world? So that idea of moral injury is quite prevalent. There's also the spectrum of trauma versus stress. At what point does stress become traumatic? And I hope I'm not being too blunt in saying that the word trauma has been used an awful lot recently. We've talked about trauma as a result of COVID, and that covers a whole bunch of things, from people on intensive care units developing full-blown PTSD, both the patients and the staff, right the way through to people who had a very stressful but hard to pin down exactly what that stress looked like time during lockdown, and some of that stress is still going on. And then, of course, if we do have stressful, negative childhood events, at what point does that become trauma? And at one level, it doesn't matter because it's all bad and we ought to be trying to make these things better. But at another level, it does affect us slightly differently. What we know is that chronic stress has particular impact on the brain that affects our vulnerability to future specific stressors or traumas, and can also, affect our ability to become resilient. And our prevention, which I'll come on to talk more at the end, has to be dealing with that. How can we tolerate stress better in the long term, that we might be more protected for future particular stresses and traumas? And if you go looking in the PTSD literature, one of the things you find in terms of major protective factors for PTSD, and don't forget, most of this research has been done after single events, type 1 traumas like earthquakes or other natural disasters, we find that personal faith is one of the most protective factors. And that could be because it gives you a different perspective. It could help because it gives us a framework for dealing with some of that moral injury. And perhaps it helps us stand back from the stress that's happening to us because we are aware of that eternal perspective. As a result of the moral injury, as a result of ongoing stress and the effect we know that has on our cortisol levels and our hormones, there can be an element of depression mixed in with PTSD. So yes, there's the flashbacks and those sorts of things, but there's also a self-blame. Why can't I snap out of this? How come I'm being affected by this? And one of those things, as I say, because of these particular ethical and moral challenges. But the other is a lot of people who have type 1 trauma don't have the childhood trauma. They don't have the history of mental health problems. They don't understand it. Their mental health was absolutely fine until that car crash. And therefore, the logical way to process that is to say, well, I've had the car crash. My leg was in plaster. My leg's now no longer in plaster. I can walk again. Physically, I'm fine. Why am I mentally fine? What is wrong with me? And our brain interprets that with phrases like, well, I must be weak. I must have not have tried hard enough to get over this. And there is the path into secondary depression. And when you're working with PTSD, you need to, sure, be working with reprocessing memories and that kind of thing, but also dealing with secondary depression if it's there. And it's really which one you tackle first. I guess it depends which of those is most prominent. And sometimes you have to work with the depression and the self-blame and the moral injury first before you can get onto the trauma work. Now, this is a slightly small slide, but I'm going to spend some time talking through it because this is the trauma timeline in terms of how it affects us at multiple stages in our lives. And we've already talked a little bit there about the development of resilience when we are younger. And resilience is one of those phrases that's sort of bandied around at the moment. We might have resilience projects at school and this kind of thing. But resilience is the ability to bounce back, the ability to withstand future stresses. And it's not something that can be taught in a classroom. It's not something that can be taught by completing resilience questionnaires or doing things. It's almost something which is caught rather than taught. It's something which is we learn through adversity, if that makes sense. We can learn about resilience. We might score very highly on a resilience questionnaire if we've read lots about resilience because we recognize it and we know what the right answers are. But are we actually resilient? Again, I would say it's to a certain extent very difficult to become resilient without having been through challenges. And that's actually quite important as we think about how do we bring up our children and protect them? Do we protect them too much that they don't have any of these challenges that perhaps we can help them through? The trick, of course, is trying to find things that are challenging, like your first day at school, but not in the traumatic sort of level, which we wouldn't want happening to people. Childhood trauma itself and the whole spectrum, I don't particularly want to talk about this too much today because we know that it's a very difficult area for many people, but just again emphasizing that idea of type 2 trauma. Also the links, we know the links with deprivation and a whole range of social factors that multiply together. So if you have the deprivation, then you perhaps are also more statistically likely to have the adverse child specific experiences, but you're also less likely to have some of the protective factors like strong supportive families and opportunities to engage in clubs and things outside of the home. So unfortunately, a lot of those things combine together to make the adverse child experience perhaps worse for many people than perhaps it is for people who have some more of those protective factors around them. Now then, for some people, there is a one-off trauma. And that could be an earthquake, it could be lots of things, it could be a car crash. And what we need to remember is that initially after that, PTSD symptoms are normal for a month or so after that. It is normal after a car crash to get flashbacks. Okay, it's a normal thing. What's happening is your brain has just received a whole bunch of really stressful information and it's taking its time to process it. It's taking its time to pad that in, to put those memories from the inbox into the past. And that takes time. So it's actually not technically possible to diagnose PTSD for the first month after that. And I'll talk a bit more about this at the end, but it's about support during that time. Not debriefing, not suppressing, not trying to make it go away. Because what we want to do is we want those memories to naturally process, and that will take quite some time. And if their memories are not processed, then we have the classic triad of PTSD. And there are these three things that come together. Intrusion, which is the flashbacks, the nightmare, these things popping unbidden into our heads. The arousal, which is the sort of stress response, the fight, flight, the startle response, that kind of thing. And also the avoidance, where there's avoidance of either the possibility of triggers, let's say in certain TV programs, or perhaps not going back to the place where it happened. All of which is perfectly understandable, but these things combine together into a perfect storm. And then the traditional PTSD has now been added to by this secondary diagnosis of complex PTSD. It's a new diagnosis in ICD-11, and it's that combination of often childhood trauma, but not necessarily childhood trauma, but a more chronic trauma, still with the PTSD symptoms, but also some of these interpersonal issues. And there's quite a big debate at the moment as to, some of the older diagnoses like emotionally unstable personality disorder or borderline personality disorder, are they actually better understood as complex trauma, complex PTSD? And the question is, in my mind is, are there PTSD symptoms present at the level sufficient to diagnose PTSD by itself? If you have the PTSD and some of the interpersonal personality difficulties, then that is complex PTSD. If it is just PTSD, then that's PTSD. And if it is just the interpersonal things, that is personality disorder, or perhaps complex trauma with a small t, but not complex PTSD. And that's important because when we come on to think about the treatment, and I'm going to say more about CBT, in particular trauma-focused CBT, in a second. There's also EMDR, which is the thing where your eyes follow the light, and your eyes are following some moving pendulum, a bit like the light on the front of Knight Rider, if you remember those programs. And that seems to help us process memories better and more easily with less distress than if we just did the memory reprocessing without the EMDR. Distress tolerance is actually a really important set of skills that enable us, particularly in complex PTSD and related areas, to actually stay in the room with the therapist. If the moment you start doing therapy, you hide away, there's floods of tears, it's probably not very effective therapy. And it can also help deal with some of the interpersonal issues that I was talking about earlier. So distress tolerance skills are really important, perhaps in that early stage, on the way to actually approaching the trauma itself. And then again, the medication is designed to effect some changes on the brain that have come about in response to the trauma, which I'll explain in a bit. So again, if there isn't PTSD, be it complex PTSD or traditional PSD, there isn't a clear role for medication. And then we need to think about recovery, because there is, I think, an idea that there is a chronic response to this. I mean, some people might have had grandparents who had traumas during the war, and it was always known that granddad was a bit different ever since he came back from the Great War. And there was that sort of chronic shutdown or response to that. I think we're getting better at understanding that, but it's so important that we continue to have compassion, to journey alongside people, to not expect them to snap out of it and suddenly go, oh yeah, it's all in the past, that's all fine, and hold that frustration with them. If some great injustice has occurred, some moral injury has occurred, then with them, be offended, be cross, because this moral injury has occurred, and we can share in that injustice with them, as well as be compassionate towards them as people. So the everyday brain and the brain during trauma, we need to think about these two areas within the brain that do quite specific things. When information arrives in the brain, the brain, first of all, says, well, what is this? It's a very specific response, an identifying response. Aha, that is a car or a walking stick or a pack of cards or something like that. And that sort of memory of what something is, and that discrimination, that is a pack of cards, that is a Mars bar. They're both small, rectangular, but I can tell them apart. That is in the hippocampus. It's quite discriminating there. And then the amygdala is the sort of adrenaline center, the fight, flight, fright kind of part of the brain. And normally those things work in tension. So sometimes the amygdala will go, oh, panic, panic, panic like this, but the hippocampus will kick in and say, don't worry, I know what that is. So think about our example of a pack of cards or a Mars bar or something like that. If I put those into my pocket or my mobile phone in my pocket, you will see a bulge in my pocket. But if I've recently been held up at gunpoint, my amygdala will go, bulge in the pocket, could be a gun in the pocket, run away, run away, run away. And the amygdala will override the hippocampus. And the goal of treatment, I suppose, is to turn down the hippocampus, turn down the amygdala, so that the hippocampus can do its job. We want to be able to remove some of the emotion and packaging around these memories so that we can do the discriminatory work. So for example, if you are someone who had been assaulted in a dark alley, all dark alleys, all dark doorways will set off the amygdala. And actually, if the hippocampus could do its job, the hippocampus would be saying, that's just another dark alley. We are quite some way away. Or that's not even a dark alley. It's just a doorway. And it's okay, because actually the dark alley is over there in a different city. And we need to try and do those together. And if you look at the brain scans of people who've had PTSD, what we find is that the amygdala is pulsating away, throwing off adrenaline. That makes sense. And the hippocampus is quieter. Sometimes you can even see on scans, not so much individual scans, but if you take 100 scans, people with PTSD, statistically, you'll see the hippocampus is 10, 15% smaller because it's almost forgotten how to be used itself. And everything is generalized. Any bulge in the pocket is a gun. Any dark alley is any dark doorway is a dark alley. Any noise is a potential threat because the hippocampus is on hyperdrive. Sorry, the amygdala is on hyperdrive and the hippocampus is not doing its job. And that's slightly technical. I apologize. As you see, I keep getting my words mixed up. You don't need to know any more detail than just one part of the brain's gone into hyperdrive and one part is not being used. And we need to try and restore that balance. And that's a combination of medication, processing of memories, and of course, time. So treatment, what sorts of treatments have we got? If you go looking in medication, first of all, in the drug books, SSRIs are up there. So these are the standard groups of antidepressants, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. And we know that SSRIs will have some response in PTSD. They're not processing the memory. Of course they're not. They're a tablet. How could they process a memory? But they will help with some of the symptoms in terms of helping us have slightly less in terms of flashbacks and things like that. And don't know exactly how they work, but we know, and some of the antidepressants have got licenses for PTSD, including some of the SSRI group. Also then we've got drugs that we know seem to act particularly on adrenaline, and they seem to be quite helpful, particularly for nightmares and that sort of thing. So prazosin and a related compound called doxazosin are alpha blockers. They're adrenaline blockers, and particularly at nighttime, they can help quite a lot with nightmares and to a certain extent during the day. Now, the problem with alpha blockers is they were invented as blood pressure tablets. So they bring your blood pressure down. And if you're taking these tablets for PTSD, it will also bring your blood pressure down. So sometimes if you stand up suddenly, you can get what we call postural hypotension, which is where your blood gets left in your boots, basically, if you stand up too quickly. And some people can tolerate them, some people can't. Trazodone is an old sedating antidepressant, which again has got some anti-adrenaline action and does seem to be quite good in terms of helping with sleep and helping with nightmares. And if you're trying to deal with trauma during the day, at least getting a decent night's sleep is a good place to start. Some people will use antipsychotics, and they need to be used very sparingly because this is not psychosis or schizophrenia we are treating, but it is intrusions, it is unbidden things coming into the brain, and antipsychotics can sometimes help with that. And there's also quite a strong overlap between trauma and psychosis. We know a lot of people with schizophrenia have a history of trauma, and piecing apart what is psychosis and what is a flashback can be quite difficult. So you often see some diagnostic conundrums there. Now, therapy is perhaps deeper. If the medication is turning down the amygdala, the question is, how do we stop the amygdala relighting up again the moment you stop the medication? And how do we kind of reawaken the hippocampus there? And CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, is the main model here. And it's really important that you are working with someone who knows what they are doing with CBT for trauma, who knows about trauma-focused CBT, because it's quite a different approach. It's a longer approach. They're longer sessions, 90-minute, 1 hour, 20-minute sessions, because not for every session, but for a part of the treatment block, in order to correctly process those memories. That is not going to get done in a standard counseling session. It will take longer to do that. And it's really important that you have fully calmed down again by the time that the session ends. What happens in those therapies? to give you a couple of analogies as to try and understand them. One is about a duvet. If you've got a duvet from a bed, and if you are trying to put that duvet away, if you shove that duvet into a cupboard, quite often the duvet doesn't go fully in. It sort of stops the door from shutting fully, and the door sits slightly ajar, and the duvet sort of poking out. And every time you walk past, you bump into the door, and the duvet goes, hello, like this. And that is a bit like what happens when we try and shove our memories away out of sight and repress them. It's almost as though they're not properly processed, so they're just going to keep pushing out until we do something with them. And how do we get that duvet in the cupboard? Well, the answer is at some point we have to get it out, spread it out on the bed, fold it up, roll it up, and slide it correctly into the cupboard. And then you can shut the door. And that's what happens with memories. When they are still surrounded by all their emotion, they don't get filed away correctly in the filing system. They bounce around. And unless you get them out, strip away some of the emotion, fold them up correctly, and put them in the filing system, they will keep peeking out. Don't forget, they will always be there. They will always be there in the memory. These traumas did happen. That memory will always be there. What we're trying to do is we're trying to get it to the point where the door can be shut and you can decide when you go and open that cupboard door. Another analogy is what's called the factory analogy. And imagine that you're running a big processing plant and you've got lorries delivering the raw materials, which are the memories every day. And the memory comes into the loading bay and it tips off the back of the lorry, and you're trying to put it on the conveyor belt so it can be taken off down to some distant part of the factory and stored away on a shelf. Think about those big shelves in Homebase or B&Q or something like that. But the problem is, because it's a massive, great memory, whenever you put it on the conveyor belt, it keeps falling off. Put it back on, keeps falling off. It's too unstable. And what you can see is, most of this is bubble wrap. And in the middle is the memory, just a few square inches of memory. And what you want to do is take that bubble wrap off, unwrap it, take all the packaging off, and then you're left with the memory. That goes on the conveyor belt, that goes down to the final of the factory, and that gets put on the shelf so you can access it when you need to. The question is, what do you do with all the packaging? And most factories will have an incinerator where all that spare packaging can be chucked away over there. This is not a recycling friendly analogy, I apologize. All that spare material can be chucked away over there and burnt off, and it gives off a great deal of heat. And that's what happens during trauma processing sessions, is you are stripping off emotional material so you can file the memory, but that means that you are creating things that need to be burnt up and will give off heat while you do that. I've spoken about EMDR already, the eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, which is the way that seems to be easier to processing memories when we are using EMDR. No one, again, entirely knows how that works. Prevention is perhaps where we want to try to be. Prevention, both in terms of preparation and the importance, and here this is why it's so important to think about some of the things that the church is actually really strong at and really good at, which is promoting good, healthy childhood experiences that will build resilience, going away to summer camps where you are taken through peak experiences, that you have a chance to conquer that abseiling wall, are so important. And also just the day by day living in this life, but having support around you is so important as we think about resilience that is caught but not taught. And also, I think the church has got a role in that early support, that first month or so. And don't forget, we're not talking about processing the memory at this point. We're not talking about debriefing. We're not talking about CBT at this point. But what we are doing is sitting with people after this thing has happened, validating and accepting their emotions, mourning with them perhaps in some of the loss and the injustice, and helping them eventually, if they need it, they do go on to get PTSD, then helping them through that therapy journey and assisting them with that and making sure they're okay after some of the more difficult sessions. But hopefully that early support, reducing the chance of what is a trauma that has happened, we can't change that. How do we reduce the chances of that turning into full-blown PTSD? By just having that support around them to help them process the memory in their own time. So we've come a long way since Craig House Hospital. If I walk out of my house and walk half a mile down the road, I can sit in the grounds. There are statues of William Rivers. There is a plaque with those poems on by Wilfred Owen and Sigurd Sassoon. And that landed in this sort of rather unpleasant narrative of 20th century war, as we realized that war was not glamorous. War was not clever. War had major significant emotional consequences, and we first began to get our heads around shell shock and then PTSD. And then over time, we've learned more about some of the chronic natures of PTSD and how that works and how we can help people on that journey using professional help. You need to be a skilled CBT therapist to work with PTSD, using professional help, but also the role of the church in supporting that. So thank you so much for listening. And I hope this session has been okay for you. And like I say, if this has affected you, please do go and talk to someone about this. You can always find more information on the Mind and Soul Foundation website. That's mindandsoulfoundation.org, or look for us on social media as well, Mind and Soul UK.